Now that your Bud Rep is properly set up, you're ready to move to Section 2. Section 2 describes best practices for completing the rent table and rent matrix tab. Now that we have the budget tab populated, we can look at the rent table tab. Both new and existing developments will need to go to this tab to enter the property information. Start by entering the property information. Remember, where you see green print, you can enter data in those cells. Enter the property name, the development ID number or D number, and the city where the development is located. In the yellow box, you have the option to use the rent table to calculate gross potential rent, GPR, or to use the manual GPR entry on line 68. For developments with 100% project-based rental assistance, such as Section 8, check the first circle, use rent table to calculate GPR. For developments without 100% rental assistance, such as a tax credit program, where rents can change once per year but not all in the same month, check the second circle to use manual GPR entry on line 68. You will be shown how to complete the rent matrix tab to calculate the gross potential rent, GPR, on an upcoming slide. For 100% subsidized properties, you will continue to complete this tab. In column A of the box highlighted is where you enter the most restrictive program. Detail all funding sources involved with this property and the rent limit percentage that you are required to comply with for each bedroom style. Next, column B is where you enter the rent limit appropriate for each funding source. Note that the gross rent limits can change annually. You can find the most current rent limit information on Minnesota Housing's website by clicking the I am, and there's a drop down, then click Rental Housing Owner or Property Manager. Then click Rent and Income Limits under the menu on the left-hand side of the screen. The rents included on this rent table are for demonstration purposes only and do not reflect the current rent limit. If you have questions about what funding sources apply to your development, consult with the owner. Column D is where you enter the number of rooms per bedroom style. How many rooms are in a one-bedroom? Look no further than the table located at the top of the page. Column E is where you enter the number of units for each bedroom type for each funding source. Column F is where you enter the square footage for each bedroom type. This information may be referenced in the development's regulatory agreement. If not, consult with the owner. Column I is where you enter the rents most recently approved by Minnesota Housing before any rent increase you may be requesting. Note, for 100% subsidized properties, asset management does not process or approve Section 8 rent increases. Use the most current rent schedule for the approved rent amounts. These rent amounts should be entered in both the current column and the proposed new rent column unless you've received an approved rent schedule for a rent increase for the upcoming year. If there are project-based Section 8 units monitored by your local PHA, enter the rents most recently approved by the PHA and provide a copy of the approval as an attachment to your annual budget submission. Next, column J is where you enter the utility allowance. Let's review how you find these numbers. A utility allowance schedule can come from a variety of sources. For a development with rental assistance, such as Section 8, the contract administrator will provide it to you. For a development without rental assistance, such as a tax credit program, you will most often use a utility allowance schedule from your local PHA or HRA. I have had success finding these schedules on the Housing Link website, which is www.housinglink.org, or by requesting it from the local Public Housing Authority, PHA. Because the utility allowance can change each year, it is important to remember where you found it. Here is an example of the utility allowance schedule from the Minneapolis PHA. Note the effective date at the top of the page. For this demonstration, the residents pay their own electric. The appropriate amounts are circled per building and bedroom type and are totaled at the bottom of the page. Enter the totals in column J on the rent table. Here's an important point. Remember to submit the utility allowance schedule as an attachment with your annual budget submission. Your budget will not be reviewed without it. Now let's finish filling out the rent table. In column J, enter the numbers that you have calculated from the appropriate utility allowance schedule. Note that column K and L are black print. These cells are protected and they contain formulas that cannot be changed. In column M, enter the proposed new rents. Remember not to include the utility allowance amount with the proposed new rent. Column N reflects a protected cell. It contains a formula that automatically totals the proposed new rent with the utility allowance. When requesting a two-tiered rent increase, you will list the new rents for new move-ins in column M. In columns O and P, the percentage of increase and dollar increase reflect the increase or sometimes decrease from the current rents to the proposed new rents. Staff will evaluate and approve all rent increases for properties with Section 8 as part of the budget review process. I will explain that evaluation process in the upcoming slide. Next, column Q reflects the effective month or the month the proposed rents will take effect. This column is typically filled in for developments with rental assistance when the rents change. For properties with calendar fiscal years, if the contract rent changes in February, enter a 2. If it changes in July, enter a 7. For developments with non-calendar fiscal years, the number 1 is associated with the month the fiscal year begins. For example, with the July to June fiscal year, if the contract rent changes in February, enter an 8. If it changes in July, enter a 1. Column R reflects the rent gap. Note that it appears in black print. The cell is protected and the formula cannot be changed. The calculation determines the difference between the most restrictive gross rents from column B and the proposed gross rents from column N. Staff will consider this calculation to see if management is maximizing its rent potential. If the rent gap is negative, the proposed gross rent is greater than the most restrictive rent for the governing program. In this case, staff would request an explanation. If in the Budget Notes tab you select Yes and want to complete a two-tiered rent increase, you will complete the rent table as above, but will list the new move-in rent in column M. Note, you will still select the Use Manual GPR entry on line 68. An important component of the rent table is the program type. It communicates which units are fixed to certain funding sources, which units are employer-owner occupied, which units receive rental assistance, and which units receive an operating subsidy. Check all the boxes that apply to the unit type. The regulatory agreement, various declarations, or other loan documents are good sources for this information. If you have questions, consult with the owner. We are almost finished with the rent table and will be moving on to the rent matrix. For developments where 100% of the units receive rental assistance, where rents are effective on a certain date reflected in a contract, it is not necessary to complete this rent matrix. Be sure that you have selected Use Rent Table to Calculate GPR button, and be certain that you have designated an effective month in column Q. For developments that do not have 100% of units with rental assistance, you will now need to complete the Rent Matrix tab located in the BUD-REP. Separate rent matrices will no longer be accepted. You first need to click Size the Rent Matrix. A dialog box will appear. In the dialog box, enter the total number of units at the property. The correct number of rows will appear for you to list all the units at the property. In column A lists the unit numbers. If you ever need to change the number of units in this table, you must first click cell A5, then click Size the Rent Matrix, and enter the correct number of units. Failure to do this will result in adding or deleting the incorrect number of rows needed to populate the chart. In column B, list the number of bedrooms in the unit. In column C, use a drop-down to select the most restrictive rent program the unit is subject to. If the program type is not listed there, select Other and list in column B. In column D, select the rent subsidy the unit has. If none, select Market. If the subsidy type is not listed in the drop-down, select Other and then list in column W. In column E, list the current rent for the unit. In column F, list the new proposed rent for the unit. Column G will automatically be calculated to show the proposed percentage of increase for the unit. In column H, enter the number associated with the month the proposed new rents will take effect due to either turnover or lease renewal. For example, if the lease ends in March, you would enter the number 4 since the rent increase will take effect in April. For developments with non-calendar fiscal years, the number 1 is associated with the month the fiscal year begins. For example, with July to June fiscal year, if the lease ends in April, you would enter 11 for the rent increase in May. Be sure to adjust accordingly. Note that only green print or white blank cells in columns A through F and column H can be edited. The numbers in column H will populate the rest of the spreadsheet and will calculate the gross potential rent, or GPR, for each month in the fiscal year. These totals will now automatically be transferred over to line 68 of the rent table. No more having to enter manually. Back to the rent table. The totals from the rent matrix will now automatically populate line 68, which in turn will automatically populate in the budget tab the proposed budget column. Remember, the use manual GPR entry on line 68 must be selected at the top of the rent table for it to populate the budget tab correctly. Requesting a rent increase. Rent increases for developments without rental assistance are typically requested once a year. Some developments request the rent increase with the budget submission. Other developments request it when the tax credit rent limits are published in the spring. Agency staff will only approve one increase per year. The rent increase must be submitted in writing, and the increase is not effective until it is approved in writing by staff. If your rent increase exceeds 5% of the current rent, staff will review the information to see if the market can support the rent proposed. Staff may request a list of comparable properties that are achieving similar rents and will confirm that the gross rents do not exceed the governing limits. Remember to submit your utility allowance schedule. Finally, staff will want to understand the impact of the rent increase for existing residents. Staff may request the current income levels of existing residents to determine if they may be displaced as a result of the new rent. For long-term homeless or high-priority homeless units without a rent subsidy, be sure to review the rent policy for unsubsidized units. This information can be found on the Rental Housing Owners and Property Managers page of Minnesota Housing's website. Keep in mind that there are many factors to be considered when determining rent increases. Consult with your assigned asset manager if you need to discuss rent increases in more detail. You have now finished the second section of completing the rent table and rent matrix. Section 3 reviews the tabs that outline the anticipated expenses for the year. If you have questions or if you have notes about the budget that you want to review in more detail, please refer to the information listed on this slide to contact the asset manager assigned to your property. The names, email address, numbers are listed under the Rental Housing Owners and Property Managers page of Minnesota Housing's website at www.minnesotahousing.gov.